All right, should be on. All right. As I was saying, I want to begin from this provocation that came out a couple years ago from our colleague Rebecca Limov, that big data is people. It's one of those simple things that once it's said, you realize just how true it is. And I've been thinking along these lines. She wrote this in the context of a kind of self-tracking devices. And I had been thinking in other contexts, in particular about the spread of mathematical methods, as Massimo so kindly indicated, over the 20th centuries, and the ways we can sometimes get lazy about the spread of mathematical methods. That at first you have people, and you have people knowledge, and then math comes in and sweeps out all the people, and you have some sort of objective, mathematical, non-human knowledge that replaces them. And this is, of course, the solution to the problems of subjectivity in schools or in industry or in management. And perhaps no field has been more visible for this transformation, I would argue at least, than baseball. And the 2003 book, and of course, since Americans read less than they watch movies, the 2011 movie, both called Moneyball, I think have been really essential to talking about the ways that statistical methods profitably, in both senses of the term, replace traditional methods of knowing about, in this case, baseball. That is to say, you could take the scouts, the old guys, the experts, and replace them with younger, more mathematically inclined, and in a sense, more rational individuals. And one reason baseball is a good topic for thinking about this is that numbers have been around in baseball for well over 170 years. It's been called a numbers game. It's supposedly a kind of unique link to using numerical analysis to understand something about sport. But of course, it's not just about baseball. It's also about the fact that people who know about baseball then become influential in other realms. So for me, two of the touchstones for this are Nate Silver, who some of you, I'm sure, maniacally check 538 before every election in the way in which we've become accustomed to these predictions, election predictions. But of course, someone like Nate Silver, first project was actually as a sabermetrician, that is to say, somebody who measures baseball, and has now been involved in what we might think of as a modern day political calculus. And this transition into and out of the larger political sphere, we're familiar with this from the history of science, from Lorraine Daston's work on probabilists in the 17th century, who moved from thinking about mathematical ideas of probability to thinking about aleatory contracts, to thinking about how you buy insurance for various purposes, for gambling rules, etc. And indeed, many other fields have taken up this challenge and have labeled their reforms Moneyball. So searching for this is very easy as a historian. So there's Moneyball sentencing, there's Moneyball policing, there's Moneyball for government, there's Moneyball for whatever your problems are. That the solution is some sort of statistical analysis. I think we're moving past this moment. I haven't seen as much in the past few years, which is a separate story we can talk about. But for a while there, the slide just kept getting denser and denser, and I had to simplify it, in fact, over time. Another aspect of the reason why baseball might be important here is that people who are critical of algorithms and critical of the use of mathematics generally are often praiseworthy about its use in baseball in particular. And so I'm thinking of Kathi ONeill's almost too cleverly titled Weapons of Math Destruction, which otherwise talks about the harmful ways that algorithms operate, but in fact baseball is singled out as a healthy use of algorithms because it's fair, it's transparent, and it's rigorous in this way. So while I was thinking about these claims about the way in which data and people are intertwined, I started to think about the ways in which we might use the history of baseball to kind of illustrate this more precisely. I happened to be on a postdoc at the time in New York City, and I discovered that the largest collection of baseball archives are actually at the New York Public Library. It's a hot tip for any of you as you're passing through New York there and you're interested. And for me, it was a kind of perfect opportunity to lower the tone and actually talk a little bit about topics that we might not normally consider as science, and in fact, the way we might learn something about science from them and learn about them through thinking about them scientifically. So I appreciate you're willing to indulge at least my interest in this topic in particular, and learn something more about the distinction that's drawn between what we might think of as scores, those who know the number, and something like scouts, or those who know the bodies or the people. So I want to begin thinking Wednesday. This is what the product of it, of course. So I want to begin today thinking about the numbers. So I want to take, when I began this project a couple years ago, Craig Biggio was up for election to the Baseball Hall of Fame. It's not important that you know who Craig Biggio is, or that you know who else is in the Hall of Fame. The point is, a part of his entrance into the Hall of Fame was this claim that everyone used. Almost every article about whether or not he was one of the greatest players of all time said he has the most doubles of any right-handed player in baseball history. And as far as statistical analysis is concerned, this is about as simple as it gets. It's a count of a specific kind of thing. That is to say, over the course of his career, he had 668 doubles. I was interested, though, how we knew this. I mean, on one hand, it's a kind of simple thing. You just add up the doubles. But in order to say he has the most doubles of any right-handed hitter, it implies that we know the total of doubles for every other right-handed hitter going back to 1870. And that struck me as a very different kind of problem, and actually a much more interesting one. So number 2 on the list, behind Craig Biggio, is actually a player named Nap Lajoie. Nap Lajoie stopped playing in 1917. That's to say, Nap Lajoie played before radio, he played before sabermetrics, he played before a kind of reliable need, at least according to Major League Baseball, to keep track of the records. And in fact, baseball's records disagree. Multiple sources list multiple different hit totals for Nap Lajoie from 1910. So all of a sudden, this struck me as a quite interesting proposition, that we're willing today to make these kinds of claims without thinking of the history behind them. That is to say, how they become reliable. So why do we collect doubles in the first place? Oh no. I'm just gonna... So where does the double originate? It originates with official scores. So there's no reason, in fact, to keep track of doubles at all. All you need in order to play baseball is outs and runs. You get 27 outs, and whoever scores the most runs in those 27 outs wins. But from the very beginning, from the 1860s onward, in fact, people writing about the rules of baseball chose to put scores on the field. That is to say, to incorporate scores as an essential element of the game. Now, some statistics you might think of as being created by umpires. So a home run or a walk. Those are it's considered to be rule statistics. They are statistics determined by the rules of the game. But other statistics, like doubles, are actually a matter of adjudicating credit. Simply because a player makes it to second base doesn't tell you whether that's due to the player's effort, that is to say the hitter's credit, or whether it's due to the fielder's problems or the fielder's errors, that is to say a debit to the fielder. And that's where the scorers come in. They come in specifically to adjudicate credit in baseball, and they were known from the very beginning as adjudicating credit. The person who put them here was a man named Edwin Chadwick, who was an early enthusiast for baseball in the 19th century, and he was specifically concerned with turning baseball into what he considered a more manly and scientific game. And the key to doing that was by having official scores. Now, Chadwick himself, an immigrant from England, was part of a much larger family of newspaper reporters and reformers more broadly. He's a classic kind of Whig reformer in the mid-19th century. And indeed, his brother, Edwin Chadwick, was the author, some of you may recognize, of the seminal Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population. This doesn't sound like a real page-turner, but in fact, for historians of public health, this is one of the most important statistical documents of the 19th century. The idea that by documenting the sanitary conditions of the laboring population in Great Britain, we might know something about where reform can take place. And indeed, Edwin wrote to Henry that while I have been trying to clean London, my brother has been keeping up the family reputation by trying to clean your sports. That is to say, the analogy was precisely known. The kinds of things that reformers are doing in public health in the 19th century is exactly the kind of action that's being taken in baseball in this period. Henry Chadwick first started thinking about baseball statistics, this is essentially what they look like. This is one of the earliest scorecards from the 1840s. This is the New York Knickerbocker Club from 1845. And as you can see pretty clearly on here, what they're keeping track of is hands out, that is to say outs and runs. That's all they were interested in, are the two essential criteria for the game. Keep track of who made the outs and who made the runs. Chadwick thought this was woefully inadequate. Ultimately, this didn't tell you anything important about the game. It didn't tell you who was successful in the right way. It didn't tell you what kinds of hits or what kinds of runs were being scored. And so what Chadwick was most interested in doing is turning this kind of analysis into an analysis that might be considered reliable data. And so this is what he proposed as an appropriate way to keep track of statistics. This is from his newspaper, the New York Clipper, from 1860. And you can see, or perhaps you can see, I'll tell you if not, that he's keeping track of outs and runs still. That's his original method of scoring. But now he keeps track of precisely where each of these outs are made, how they're made, who makes them, whether the play is well made when they're made, and he keeps track of who, in fact, is committing any problems or any errors in the making of these plays. Which is to say, it's not just a matter of seeing who should win the game. It's a matter of seeing who played in the best way possible during the game. Rearrange this. For Chadwick in this way, proper scoring here was always a matter of moral accountability. And so in his own method of scorekeeping, he wanted to provide this full analysis in a uniform manner. He actually sold his scorecards. He saw it as actually a kind of good business opportunity as well. But he portrayed it not as a business opportunity, but rather as a matter of creating reliable, standardized data. In this sense, what he was ultimately concerned with is actually distinguishing good plays from bad plays. That is, distinguishing plays that should be rewarded and praised from plays that shouldn't. And so his emphasis here is not at all on what play follows which player is causing runs to be scored. He's not interested in that. He's interested in whether a player has recorded a certain number of positive kind of events or a certain number of negative events, because he wants to pass judgment. Historian Jules Teigel famously put it as a series of mini morality plays. That's what Chadwick wants to create. He wants to turn baseball into a morality story and a morality play. And that's what his data was by and large used for. For Chadwick, a scorer should be one also whose gentlemanly conduct will render him acceptable to all who are liable to make inquiries of them relative to the score of the game. What he's interested in here is not just determining the player's conduct, but also the conduct of the scorers themselves. That is to say, if you're making judgments about credit, you yourself need to be a creditable person. And what Chadwick is drawing on here is actually a long history of English philosophical tradition where the right people to do scientific research, that is to make judgments that are objective and reliable, are in fact gentlemen. They're men, for one thing, which was not incidental to Chadwick, but secondly, they're gentle, which is to say they're insulated from any sort of bribery. They don't need the money. You can't buy his scorers off. And that's what he's ultimately interested in. You can see this is an excerpt from his own scorecard where he's quite clear that he wants to distinguish bases made by good hits from bases made by fielding errors. He's absolutely clear that everything deserves its own place on here. More broadly, you might think of the kind of overall scorecard as double entry bookkeeping. And I think that's the right way to think of it here, because every play is always entered as either a credit to the offense or a debit to the defense, and it's entered on both sides of the ledger. And so you're quite clear whether your performance of the game is due to your success or your other team's failure. And this to him is ultimately the crucial aspect of it. So by the 1870s, this is again from the 1860s, by the 1870s when you get the first professional games of baseball, the data infrastructure is already established. You have a mode of record keeping, you have a technique of actually turning the action of the game into a series of records. You have an instruction manual for how you might do this with the individuals who are actually on the field and how to regulate who should in fact keep the records. And I think importantly, we should also remember that these are indeed paper records. So they're paper inscriptions. And so the basic idea by the 1870s is that you'd fill out a paper form. This form's from 2015, but it's essentially the same form as they were using in the 1870s with a few different statistics added over the years. You'd mail it in to John Heidler, who's you mail it into the late 19th century, the Secretary of the National League. He or his designate, later the Elias Sports Bureau, would compile it. They would create a day-by-day ledger. As you can see on the left there, that's the ledger being looked at by contemporary archivists at the Baseball Hall of Fame Library. And then at the end of the year, they would add everything up and they'd publish the year-end records. And so what you have here is actually a kind of technology of scorekeeping to make an inscription that could then travel in our ways of thinking about classic, historically significant modes of generating objective knowledge. And so if we go back then to, my goodness, if we go back then, I'm making my machine very mad, to this 668 doubles, what we actually can ask is where this number comes from. That is to say, what kind of genealogy is there to take us back to someone like Chadwick? Well, the first thing to note is that Baseball Reference, although it's one of the leading sources for baseball statistics, actually has nothing to do with Major League Baseball. They don't share their knowledge at all. They don't share the records. They differ on certain crucial aspects of the historical record. Instead, Baseball Reference was designed by a guy named Sean Foreman, who took his statistical database by downloading it from a pirated database that had been published in 1997 by another Sean named Sean Lehman. Sean Lehman had created his website. This is the best I could get for a 1997 website. This is a problem historians are going to have moving forward. Our slides are going to get way worse as we cite websites. I'll just flag that for you. In any case, this website, where did Sean Lehman get his statistics for the baseball archive? It turns out he did something that doesn't really happen much anymore. That is to say, he scraped the data off one of those CD-ROMs that comes with the books from the mid-1990s, this moment where actually what they did was create an image of every page in the book, put it on the CD-ROM, and then what Lehman did is actually scrape the data off the CD-ROM and then use the emerging database software, the MySQL database creation software, to create his database, publish it freely online. And then, of course, that was downloaded and then turned into baseballreference.com. So we could ask all kinds of questions about copyright here, about interesting questions about intellectual property. But you can also ask, where did this come from? Where did the total baseball emerge from? And it turns out it emerged from Pete Palmer's computer. So this is Pete Palmer, he was born in 1938, and his computer actually originally held the database. Well, that's fine, but his computer certainly didn't originate the database, and instead it was 30,000 punched cards that Pete Palmer had accumulated over his career and then processed on a controlled data corporation 6600 in order to actually add up all the statistics over time in order to create his own database that he stored on his computer that then he put into the book that then got put on the CD-ROM by the publisher that then was scraped and uploaded to the internet. And of course, where did he get this? He got it from looking at the year-end records that were published by precisely people like Heidler at the National League office. That is to say, he was able to aggregate it and to turn it into data that then just seamlessly seems to emerge from your computer screen, but actually has a quite specific genealogy and a quite specific material history that we might want to think about more carefully anytime we're downloading or consulting these kinds of online resources, which essentially erase the process of their creation. You might ask why he needed a supercomputer to check the totals. The answer is he didn't need a supercomputer, but he worked for Raytheon and Systems Development Corporation, and so he had one. And when he wasn't looking for satellites coming over Alaska, he was stationed in Alaska and trying to determine whether the celestial objects were Russian missiles or in fact birds or the moon. And when he wasn't doing that, he was actually using the same computing software to design this. I think there's a whole book to be written about downtime in computing in the 1950s to the 1980s. And this is a great example of what happens when you have downtime on computers. But the answer, when he tried to actually figure out whether the data all added up, that is to say, whether a team's total added up, whether each player's total would add up to a team's total, that kind of classic, whether a player's total in a season would add up to a player's total in a career, he found out they almost never added up. And that's because if you'll think about it, Heidler wasn't concerned with that. Heidler was concerned with taking the data that comes in with the scores and putting them in his book. He didn't care whether they added up over the course of a season or a career. That wasn't his interest. And so indeed, he found, Palmer, found thousands and thousands of discrepancies through the 100 or so years of data he looked at. And he then had to go back and correct every single one of these discrepancies actually to publish his database. This sounds miserable to me. He says it was miserable when I spoke with him, but luckily he had help because the Society for American Baseball Research had been founded in 1971. And so as he describes it, he had gremlins all over the country trying to track down these kinds of one-off situations where a game had been entered twice or somebody had mistaken a 7 for a 1 in the records, and then the records would be off by precisely 6 after that particular day. And they went back and did this for 16 baseball teams over the course of 101 seasons, playing about 150, 160 games a season, which you can quickly realize at 4 or 5 at-bats per game is a whole lot of events that you want to go back. You also might be interested in the fact that, of course, the records are just the records. You can't magically invent this kind of record keeping. And in particular, the best source of records tended to be the newspapers. But back when there were multiple newspapers per city, they almost never agreed with each other because they would keep their own statistics. So doing this kinds of work is ultimately historical work. It's not really scientific work in this way. It's a kind of deep historical research at the heart of it. And when I was learning about this, what I kept thinking about are what we're starting to call kind of data-driven sciences more broadly. That is to say, all these data collection efforts that involve a kind of mix of lay personnel and expertise. And you might think of Etienne Benson's work on bird banding, or work that's been done on New Deal interviewers in the 1930s, or work on baby observers in early pediatrics. There's a lot of this kind of interesting history of science work that's going on to talk about the mobilization of thousands of historical records and the work it takes. And I think that's probably the best description of what's actually going on here in the creation of this database. And so these 668 doubles, this simple number, seemingly simple number, kind of led me on this path to try and really figure out what's the infrastructure involved in creating this, and in particular, what's the role of human labor and human expertise in a number that seems precisely devoid of either human labor or expertise in the process of its creation. The other thing I wanted to at least think carefully about as I was going through this process is the way in which one, at least criticism you can make at this point, is that fine, but this is history. Now everything's born digitally in this way of talking about it. That now statistics don't emerge because someone writes them down, but rather they emerge because an algorithm has produced them. They emerge because a computer has spat them out. And indeed, I think among historians of science, we're undecided what to do with the difference between this born digital data after about 1980 or so, 1970 maybe, and what comes before it. And just to give you a sense of this debate, if you're unfamiliar with it, on one side are those like Hallam Stevens who believe that actually scaling up this kind of big data moment where you have computer-generated data has created qualitatively different kinds of knowledge-making practices. There's almost no relationship, that is to say, between the type of biology, in his case, that takes place in the 1950s and the type of biology that takes place in the 1990s. These are qualitatively different production of knowledge, and it's because of the computer. And on the other hand, you have someone like David Armstrong, who's recently published in Social Studies of Science, saying that actually nothing is new. Data is dated. We've always collected data, and the current use of data is just built on the back of a long history of data collection. And then, of course, there are the people in the middle that kind of hedge their bets and say something, as John Agar does, that pre-existing material practices of computation indeed determine what electronic computers do in a sense, but they still enable qualitative shifts. That is to say, there still might be something qualitatively different about it. I don't think we're decided on this point, and I'm certainly not going to adjudicate it today, but it did get me to think a little bit more intensely about the current source of baseball data, which is something called Statcast. And Statcast is, for baseball fans, this kind of production. It's about 16 petabytes of data a year that get produced by the system, and it seems, again, to just be this born digital data. But if you actually go to Chelsea Market, where Statcast is located, the first thing you note is that it's in Chelsea Market, which is interesting, but not irrelevant. It's actually located directly across the street from the Google offices, because that's the 9th Avenue superhighway. Just another reminder that data is always material, and they wanted to be directly across from Google so they could access the infrastructure of delivering streaming content. The second thing you might notice about them is, in fact, that there's a ton of people there, that there's a full-time staff of 26 whose only job is to clean the baseball data in order for it to look right when it goes out to fans and to teams. And this full-time staff of 26 is actually backed up by a part-time staff of many dozens who come in at the end of each season to clean the data and to get it in the form. And the other thing you note is that the actual code they're using to run this project, to run Statcast, was the same code that was used in Project Scoresheet. This wide effort in the mid-1980s to create play-by-play data, and the very code that they used to encapsulate games in a computerized format was picked up directly by Major League Baseball, and indeed is the same code sent out to teams every year. So here we have a perfect example of seemingly born digital data that has no material presence, and yet again you have expertise, you have materiality, and you have this way in which previously existing computational methods are built upon in order to develop something that seems qualitatively new. All right, I want to leave numbers behind and at least transition to scouting for a few minutes. And I thought there's no better way to talk about scouting than actually to allow a scene from Moneyball to do it for me. You'll note, if you're confused, the ugly guys are the scouts, and the beautiful man is the guy who's going to replace the ugly guys. This is about all you need to know about the theory behind the film. Let's see if this works.
You're unhappy, Brady. Why? Wow. May I speak candidly? Sure, go ahead. Major League Baseball and its fans, they're going to be more than happy to throw you and Google Boy under the bus if you keep doing what you're doing here. You don't put a team together with a computer, Billy. No? No. Baseball isn't just numbers. It's not science. If it was, then anybody can do what we're doing, but they can't because they don't know what we know. They don't have our experience, and they don't have our intuition. Okay? So you got a kid in there that's got a degree in economics from Yale. You got a scout here with 29 years of baseball experience. You're listening to the wrong one. Now, there are intangibles that only baseball people understand. You're discounting what scouts have done for 150 years, even yourself. Adapt or die.
So there's the movie in a nutshell, right? Adapt or die. And I think there's a lot we could talk about with this particular clip, but I just note that the language that's used, that is to say experience, intuition, intangibles, that's the same language scouts use all the time to talk about their own expertise. But when he mentions that scouts have been doing this for 150 years, what I was interested in is that he doesn't actually talk about what scouts do. And what scouts have done for 150 years is actually turn their experience, intuition, and intangibles into written records of the players. That is to say, what scouts have mainly done is generate data about the same players they're looking at. So the idiom here, even though it is an idiom of experience, intuition, and intangible, interestingly, the product is again a largely numerical written record of what players do. Going back to the earliest origins of scouting, scouts, this is from 1910, each club had a scouting force of veteran players to scour the entire country, seeking men who by their playing show promise. This goes back a long way. And for most part of the history of baseball, essentially what scouts did was negotiate costs. That is to say, for the vast majority of baseball history, scouts essentially needed to settle on a price for the player. There was a kind of wide open market, in short, for players' labor. And as long as you signed a player, then the team would own the player. And the way the reserve clause was set up, it's kind of inside baseball here, but the way the reserve clause was set up, nevertheless, you own that player's labor forever. And you were the one who decided what the player would get paid, who he'd get traded to. So the one key moment for both players and teams was that original moment, that deciding what a player would sign for. And that's indeed what the scouts were most interested in doing. And the way they did that was to create a written record of various kinds. And the most common type of written record in the early part of the century was the letter. And this is a letter from 1964. It's a scout, Herb Stein. And Herb Stein has watched a prospect, Rod Carew, play baseball. And Rod Carew has been offered $5,000 by Herb Stein. And what Herb Stein does here is he's described why Rod Carew deserves $5,000. That I've seen this boy in a number of games. Physically, he has a fine body, he has no known injuries or physical defects, etc. And this is a whole source of data that some other historian should go through to talk about how bodies are construed in scouting reports. It's an amazing resource, and now there's something like 30,000 scouting reports and letters available freely online for anyone to find, and it's an amazing resource to thinking about how bodies. But the point here is that basically, I think I could get him for $5,000. Who cares what he's worth? I can get him for $5,000. That's a low price for us. He's willing to sign for that price, and then we'll own his labor. And scouting here is clearly a practice of record keeping, but it's record keeping to determine a price. Things would change dramatically very quickly, though. Well, I should say, before I do that, we're familiar with this idea, first of all, from Caitlin's own work on 19th century ledgers, and from many other contexts of thinking about paper tools. That is to say, what these scouts are doing isn't irrelevant. What they're doing is actually narrowing what they're looking at. They narrow their vision to what they think is essential, and then they write that down, and then they pass that on. And so it's not just a simple recording of what's going on here. Just like when a doctor writes down what happened in your interaction, it might not be what you think happened to your interaction, but it's what creates a record that then becomes useful. It becomes what has been called a paper technology in this way. And I think that's precisely what's going on here. In any case, the very next year after 1964, after Rod Carew was signed, baseball changed this process dramatically. The main reason they did it, this shouldn't surprise anyone, is that the poor teams continually lost out to the rich teams. There is no mystery why the Dodgers, the Giants, and the Yankees won almost everything there is to win between the 1940s and the 1960s. People in New York remember this as the glory days. Everywhere else in the country remembers this as fairly miserable. But the reason is because they had the money and they could sign all the prospects. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough people on their side, and the teams outnumbered them. And in 1965, the other teams ganged up on largely the New York teams, and then St. Louis as well, and Philadelphia as well, and essentially passed what was called the free agent draft, the Rule 5 draft. And now what would happen is that every team would get a chance to select a player and then that player could only sign with that one team for the following year. What this meant, of course, is that players had almost no control or very little control over what they got paid relative to prior years, but the teams themselves would have to be very careful about who they drafted, because if you drafted the wrong guy, you had to wait till every other team would pick before you'd get to draft again. So in scouting terms, this changed the process from selling the team to the player, that is to say, sign with us for $5,000, and instead what you're doing is you're selling the player to the team. You're telling the team, we really need to get this guy. Don't worry about the money, we'll sort that out. We really need to draft this particular player. Not surprisingly, this put a premium on a different kind of scouting. And indeed, scouting would change dramatically after 1965. One of the first changes was the institution of the Major League Scouting Bureau, and this is to say an independent group that was actually writing reports on all the prospects. Because now you couldn't just go out and try and get a few prospects, sign the players you wanted. The players you saw, chances are somebody else saw them too, and because of the draft system, chances are you wouldn't draft them, and so all your work in identifying them would come to naught. And so instead you could outsource it to the Major League Scouting Bureau. The other aspect of the Major League Scouting Bureau that's important is that now a team wanted to make its knowledge of the prospects commensurate with the knowledge from the Major League Scouting Bureau. And the way they did that, not surprisingly, was to use numerical ratings. And so numerical ratings here entered scouting reports as a way to translate knowledge between different groups that might not previously had knowledge. The Scouting Bureau initiated this 2 to 8 system. I should say the numbers were used prior to the Major League Scouting Bureau, but nevertheless, they are the ones who established the 2 to 8 system, and then every other team essentially followed this system thereafter. I have never found evidence, but would love to. I was desperate for it, that the 2 to 8 scale was copied from the SAT's 200 to 800 scale, because they're both centered on 500, they both emerged at about the same time in popular consciousness, even though the SAT is older, but I never could find the smoking gun. But I've said it in every talk since, because I feel like it should be true. But nevertheless, I have no evidence for that. But they use a 2 to 8 scale, and they grade on major league numbers, which is to say 5 is somebody who will eventually become a major league player. You'll also note here that they're distinguishing present from future grades. This is part of the trick of scouting, is that you have to both give a grade for the way the player is now and the way he will be eventually at his peak playing performance. That is to say, you have to try and grade both the present and the future. Teams found it, not surprisingly, very difficult to calibrate these kinds of grades, but they worked incredibly hard to calibrate these grades among their scouts. And so part of what they would do, for example, is that they would, you can't read this, but what it says is, here are the different levels of grades. So if you give a 4 for a home run hitter, that means he's able to hit the ball 300 feet. If he's able to hit it 350 feet, that would be a 5. If he's able to hit it 400 feet, that'd be a 6. So they worked hard to calibrate. This is from a slightly later one, where you can see actually the rules are extensive here. In order to get an 80, you have to have 93 mile an hour fastball. You should walk about 0 people per 9 innings. For a hitter, you should have 300 hits a year. You should have 28 home runs a year. Your time to first base should be 3.9 or 4.0 seconds. You should have a 60-yard dash of 6.4 or lower. That is to say, they're using this full range of technologies and standardization procedures to try and make this number as reliable as possible, acknowledging that it's incredibly difficult to try and guess what an 18-year-old will be able to do 10 years from now. And of course, this 18-year-old, you might say to yourself, why aren't they using statistics, right? Where they have the playing statistics for the 18-year-old. But no one thought an 18-year-old's playing statistics were any use at all for trying to gauge their major league quality. There are a number of reasons for this, but the main one is simply they have played against no competition. If you don't have the best statistics on your baseball team and on your league, or in your league at 18, you're not a prospect for the major leagues, essentially. You should be the best person you have ever seen on the baseball field to have any prospect of making it to the major leagues. In a situation like that, statistics are are essentially useless. So they couldn't rely on the same statistical procedures that you might if you were looking at drafting major league players. Is yet another example of this kind of material. The next thing the Major League Scouting Bureau did was take this data and turn it into a single number, what they called the overall future potential. They still, of course, asked for how much they thought players would be worth. This was important. Teams wanted to know what players were worth, but their real concern was having one number for every player. And this makes sense. If you have a stack of potential players to draft, knowing that you have 50 excellent players does not tell you who to draft first. What you need is a rank order. And indeed, that's what the overall future potential did. It turned it into a rank ordering of players from very best to very worst. So all you had to do was take the player off the top of the pile, decide whether or not he'd been drafted, or figure out whether he'd been drafted yet, and if not, you draft him. And then that's the way you'd go through your pile. So it was a very different mode of quantifying players. Not surprisingly, when they first instituted the overall future potential, scouts just graded players as they always had, and then they made up a number for the overall future potential. But then the Major League Scouting Bureau had to write to scouts that it became very apparent that the overall future potential number was not compatible or relative to the individual numbers used in grading a boy's various skills. We gave this a great deal of thought, they said, and on the following pages is a formula, which we think will help our scouts come up with the right numbers if they choose to use it. We understand, they acknowledge, that in dealing with human beings, there are absolutely no mathematical formulas that will always get the job done right, but it is a guideline for them to use. So here's an amazing moment where they want people to quantify. They realize that they're quantifying, but they're making up numbers. They realize there's no formula they could really use to solve this problem, but nevertheless, they're going to try. And so what they do is they give instructions on how to average, in layman's terms, the grades given for the future skills. And so they average all the grades, you'll get a basic number, and then what they allow you to do is to adjust it up or down. And this is one of the things I was really interested in, because they didn't want it exclusively to be mechanical. They wanted to acknowledge that after you've done all your calculations, you may still want to adjust up or down. And so they allowed that. But what they also said is that you had to explain why you were doing that. So even though you were the one giving all the grades and you were the one calculating the average, if you adjusted it beyond that, you had to explain your reasoning. The scouts also instituted what they called cross-checkers. So these would be other scouts who would go and do spot checks to make sure the scouts were giving the correct grades. We might call this inter-rater reliability in a modern statistical notion of how to actually ensure the grades are being given to players. And so it's no surprise to me, at least, that by the 1980s, scouts are under this regime of quantification, and they, in fact, were very angry with it. They said, here are two quotes in the 1980s, "Scouting's more of a numbers game now," or "Scouting had become too scientific after the draft." What's interesting to me about this is these are not scouts complaining about the 30-year-old GMs that are coming into front offices. These are not scouts complaining about Bill James and other data analysis gurus. These are scouts complaining about their own practice has become too scientific, too numbers-based by the 1980s, at exactly the same time that we see these broader transformations. So I want to finish today by offering a few thoughts on what we might take away in a kind of larger history of thinking about quantification. And the first thing I want to do is defer to, of course, our kind of locus classicus for thinking about quantification in American life, Ted Porter's Trust in Numbers from the mid-1990s. And one of his claims for why people trusted in numbers is that the reliance on numbers and quantitative manipulation minimizes the need for intimate knowledge and personal trust. That is, quantification was a strategy of impersonality. One of the, and we can go into this if people are interested, but I think people are familiar with this idea. One of the interesting things about this is that in scouting, this never seemed to be the case at all. So for instance, a scouting report is never a view from nowhere. It's always a view from a specific person on a specific day, where the day and the person are always carefully notated on every single report. That is to say, the process of quantifying is never an attempt to remove the person behind the reports. And indeed, as one of the general managers noted, some reports are faceless because you don't know the scout who wrote them. And those reports are useless. You have to know the person who did the quantifying in order for the quantifying to be useful at all. So this seems not to be a story about impersonality or a kind of reduction in the role of the personal, but in fact a kind of mobilizing of how you might take subjective judgments and turn them into powerful, objective matters of fact in this way. I think this is a broader story here. As Massimo kindly said, I'm now working on medical statistics, and I think there's an interesting relationship here between medical statistics and scouting reports, where medical statistics quite similarly are aggregated data. That is to say, most clinical trials involve aggregated data for many thousands of people, but out of the trial is meant to come data that's personally suited to precisely your needs. And so the origins of precision medicine, and certainly the origins of evidence-based medicine, are in this interplay between aggregated data, data that is depersonalized, and yet it's lessons for how you deal with the clinical situation where you have one individual in front of you and you're trying to create a reliable plan of treatment for this one individual. And that interplay is not impersonal in any meaningful sense, but it's about going between the personal and the impersonal. So how might we use this example to kind of rethink mid-century quantification in a much broader sense of what we know about mid-century and how we might think about baseball in this context? So one takeaway that I hope I've suggested is that it's not about impersonality or impersonal reviews, but rather it's about trying to actually mobilize subjectivity in a meaningful way. I think another lesson is that we often forget about histories of statistics is that the history of statistics has largely ignored the Cold War. We pretend that the Cold War doesn't exist, and historians of the Cold War have essentially pretended the history of statistics by and large doesn't exist. And so it's a little cheap, but to take a recent example on the history of Cold War rationality, there's no statistics